Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Thank you for joining us. My name is Meera Mawani, and I'm the member of Association for the Study of Ginans. Welcome to yet another exciting talk in our webinar series, Ginan Insights, which aims to explore different aspects of Ginans and deep dive into them. Through the series, we hope to bring to the forefront past and current areas of research in Ginans, so that this remarkable poetic heritage sparks greater awareness and space for sharing knowledge and perspectives and inspire young people to study and research this wonderful literature and tradition of Ginans. Today we have a very special guest. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Tazim Kassam. Alija Sahiba, Dr. Tazim R. Kassam is a professor at Syracuse University who teaches courses on Islam on topics such as history, gender, and literature. She specialized in Shia Ismaili Muslims for her doctorate at McGill University. Professor Qasim has chaired the Department of Religion at Syracuse University and won several awards, such as the National Endowment of Humanities Fellowship. In the Ismaili community, she has served as a national member of the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board for Canada and the Aga Khan Foundation in the USA. She is an avid fan of Hindustani classical vocal music and has been a student of renowned Indian classical vocalist Padma Bhushan Dr. Prabha Atre. Professor Qasim also supports the work of South Asian Studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Her book, Songs of Wisdom and Circles of Dance, Hymns of the Muslim Saint Pir Shams, was published by the State University of New York Press in 1995. It explores the origins, identity, and creative sense of Ismaili Muslims in South Asia, expressed through their vast literary and musical traditions of religious hymns called Ginans. In this groundbreaking work, Professor Qasim offers an extensive translations of the Ginans, including the Garbhis attributed to Pir Shams, who is one of the most important yet enigmatic figures in the literary traditions of Ginan. As one of the reviewers of the book has written, this work represents an important historical reconstruction of the beginnings of Satpanth Ismailism, a phase of Ismaili history that has spanned over 8 centuries. Professor Qasim has also edited 2 other books, Lines of Water, Religious Boundaries in South Asia, and Ginan's Texts and Context. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Qasim. During the Q&A session, we will be joined by Rai Hussain Jasani, who heads South Asian Studies at the IIS and has been a researcher of Ginan studies over 25 years. He has identified, digitized, and dated world's oldest Ginan audio recordings. A warm welcome to you both. Professor Qasim, it is an honor to have you with us today, and we are all very excited to hear your presentation on your groundbreaking book, Songs of Wisdom and Circles of Dance, Hymns of the Muslim Saint Pir Shams. Over to you, Professor Qasim.
Well, thank you so much, Meera, for that very generous introduction. I am going to share my screen right now, and please bear with me in terms of my technological savvy. Let's see if this works. Okay, there we are. Right, so first I want to thank the Association of the Study of Ginans for inviting me to give this presentation on my work on Pir Shams and the Garbhis. Secondly, I want to pay respect to the late Mr. Pyarali Jiva, who did so much for the study of Ginans. Through his collection of texts, preparation of a database, extensive recordings, and organization of several conferences. It is our good fortune that Mr. Jiva donated his entire collection to the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and hopefully this will be available to future Ginan scholars. I also want to recognize the work of Zawahir Moir, who published the first translations of select Ginans with Christopher Shackle. In my talk today, I will offer a brief background to my book and the Ginaan tradition, and then say something about the compositions attributed to Pir Shams, especially the Garbhis. I have said before that there is no question whatsoever that the Ginaan tradition is remarkable and singular in the role it has played in the history of Ismailism. It is, as Hazrat Imam has said in one of his farmans, a wonderful tradition that should be maintained and cherished over the generations. I say that the Ginaan tradition is singular in the history of the Ismaili Tariqah because this literature not only gave birth to a community in the Indian subcontinent some 8 centuries ago, but also spread and sustained it over the centuries. It has been an inspiration for the community, giving it direction and a shape, and it established a distinct literary and song tradition. Moreover, it continues to be a living tradition that plays a central role in the religious ceremonies of the community today. My own interest in the Ginans stem from the inspiration of my father, Mukhi Rahim Count Qasim Jivarat, who is one of the finest proponents of these hymns. He has a remarkable, distinct way of singing them and captures perhaps how they might have been sung a century ago when there were no microphones. Their meaning and the passion with which they were sung shows through in his singing. And from East Africa to London and Canada, he is well known for both his rendition of Ginans and the Arabic Dawah. What was even more striking is that his friends in college, whom we met in London some 40 years later, asked him to sing Ginans. One was a Hindu and the other one was a Jain, meaning there was something about the Ginans that made them very accessible and attractive both in meaning and recitation. This fascinated me, and I wanted to know how the Ginans both fit within the larger Ismaili tradition as well as within the Indic context. As you are well aware, the Ismailis trace their history back to the Prophet. Together with the Shia, they believe that Prophet Muhammad chose Hazrat Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, to see him as a leader of the community and inherit his role both as interpreter of the faith and leader of the fledgling Muslim community. This was in the 6th century in Arabia, some 14 centuries ago. While I don't intend to go into the history of the Ismailis, I think it is relevant to point out that in the first few centuries after the Prophet's life, the Shia, which comes from the word Shiatul Ali, the party of Ali, tried to establish the rightful place of the Imams, both in a political and religious sense. The success of the Shia was limited and short-lived. The Fatimids, who established themselves in Egypt, were perhaps the most noteworthy. Early on, certain concepts evolved among the Shia, such as the distinction between Zahir and Batin, the outward and inner, ideas that were embraced by Sufis and much later even by some Sunnis. Now, given the intense pressure and persecution of the Sunnis, the Shia evolved by necessity a practice of sometimes hiding their identity to survive, called taqiyya. These features, in addition to the central position of the Imam, are hallmarks of the early Shia tradition, and they are particularly important for the Ismailis, especially after Fatimids in Egypt lost rule. The anti-Ismaili movement of the Sunni Seljuks, the Sunni Seljuk rulers, was sufficiently powerful that the Imams had to go into hiding, though a small community continued in Alamut, established by Hassani Sabah in Iran. During the period of the Fatimids, an institutional network of Ismaili officials, diplomats, and teachers developed called the Dawah. Some of them were sent to Sindh, though their influence was short-lived and tragically ended with the ravages of Muhammad Ghazna. It is during the Alamut period, that is between the 11th and 13th centuries, that Dais, who came to be known as Pirs, were sent to the Indian subcontinent. And their movements and activity, however, had to be guarded and unobtrusive because of the constant threat the Ismailis faced. And one might say that most of the network or Dawah operated in Takia, especially after the destruction of Alamut in 1256 by the Mongols, who destroyed their fortress, including their libraries. One can establish that the Pirs were sent to the Indian subcontinent, and this includes what we now know as India and Pakistan, to preach the teachings of Ismailism, but in a way that was sensitive to the local context. It is logical that if the Pirs had tried to communicate in Arabic or Persian, they would not have been able to convey these teachings as effectively. And so what they did was to learn local languages and get familiar with local religious and cultural practices. Thus, the Ginans have a very rich vocabulary, including Hindi, Gujarati, Saraiki, Sindhi, Khadi Boli, interspersed with modified Farsi and Arabic terms. This gives us some idea of their primary areas of activity, mainly Gujarat and Sindh. And references in Ginans to places like Delam Desh also signals the general area from which the earliest Pirs came. The form the Pirs adopted to convey their teachings was this new poetic and song tradition that they created, which they called Ginans, and repeatedly encouraged their followers to sing ritually. A very common verse is Ginan Bolore Nitanure Baria. What this verse also illustrates is the very high status given by the Pirs to the Ginans as containing nur or light, which you can symbolically understand as the nur of knowledge or the imam or divine light. Now, these Ginans had two dimensions, a poetic form, but also a melody, meaning that they were first and foremost an oral tradition, meant to be recited or sung. Although we refer to Ginan as literature, it is important to bear in mind that their fundamental manifestation or form is songs, which is why the title of my book translates them as songs of wisdom. So we have to keep in mind this performative nature of the Ginans in Ismaili worship. As you know, this tradition of Ginans was composed by many Pirs, and it is estimated there are as many as 1,000 Ginans that might be only 4 or 5 verses long, like Gatamahayavine, and then very long grunts, like Anantakaro. So this is what I mean when I say the Ginans represent a remarkable tradition, both in terms of its vastness, continuity, and establishment of a community's religious life. Now, there are several Pirs who preached in the subcontinent. The second after Pir Satgur Nur was Pir Shams, also known as Pir Shams Zavari. My book is devoted to him and his compositions. In addition to Ginans, he is credited with composing the Garbhis, a cycle of some 28 songs, about 18 verses each. And since the Garbhis are songs that are sung while dancing, I have tried to capture this in the title of my book as Circles of Dance. And you heard some Garbhis recited before this presentation. What we know about Pir Shams historically is very limited. My research led me to the conclusion that he most probably lived and worked around 1150 CE. Sometimes his identity was conflated with Shamsi Tabriz, the master of the Sufi mystic Jalaluddin Rumi, and sometimes with Imam Shamsuddin Muhammad. But we can say with fair certainty that Pir Shams was distinct from these figures, and his mausoleum in Multan is in present-day Pakistan. Now, I want to make a distinction between communal memory and history. The Ginans composed by the Pirs remained an oral tradition for many centuries. Pir Sadruddin, who lived around the 14th century, is credited with inventing a special script called Khojki to record the Ginans in manuscripts. But the earliest one in the IIS collection, that's the Institute of Ismaili Studies collection, is around 1720. What we know, therefore, about the early Dawah in the Indian subcontinent is thus primarily from what is found in the Ginans. The story of the activities of the Pirs, in particular Pir Shams, are from Ginans and Garbhis attributed to him. We will find references to him performing miracles, like bringing down the sun to cook meat or reviving a dead body, and contests with other Muslim saints whom he defeated. These references created tales or legends that fleshed out his figure and powerful actions. But it might be helpful to understand these stories as the community's recognition of Pir Shams's foundational role in the establishment of the community in the Indian subcontinent. If we consider them in light of the concept of Zahir and Batin, the symbolic meaning of these stories may capture the Pir's powerful personality or influence, and his capacity to convincingly convey his teachings that attracted many followers. Now notice that I have not used the word conversion when referring to the Pirs and their activity. The reason is that although the Dawah historically was engaged in diplomacy and preaching, the methods of approach were not violent and aggressive. The word Dawah itself means invitation. So the modus operandi was to convince the listeners through a logic that would appeal to them. And this often meant conveying ideas in the forms that they understood and convince them that the path that the Dais were showing was the right path. In the Indian context, the Pirs referred to this path as Satpanth, which means true or pure path, which can be viewed as parallel to or even a direct translation of Sirat al-Mustaqim. What I have tried to argue elsewhere is that in many Ginans, the Pirs were so adept that they could portray their teachings in a way that, depending on how you looked at them or understood them, your framework would change. I have used the image of the two faces and the chalice or cup to convey this. Depending on how you focus your vision, you will either see the faces or the cups. One place where we can most clearly observe this approach are the Garbhis, attributed to Pir Shams. Now, like I said before, this might actually have happened, or it could be a memory captured of an event or events that happened. The most important thing, however, is that the Pir effectively shifted the religious framework of the locals that he was preaching to, from one that was familiar to them to a new one that still made sense. The Garbis of the Ginans comprise a cycle of 28 compositions, which I have translated in my book, which average about 18 verses each. That is, about 500 verses. The scene in the festival of Navratri, the scene is the festival of Navratri, which those of you who are watching from India are most familiar with. Navratri is a 9-day festival of dance, singing, and celebration of the mother goddess Durga, or Mata Bhavani, who killed the demon Maha Ashura. Now, this is a Dandiya Ras actually in a South Indian community with the deity in the center. There are regional variations of the story of Navratri. For instance, in South India, Navratri is linked to Dasara, and the story is that Ram worshipped Durga before starting off for his journey to defeat the demon Ravana. But the basic theme is the conquest of good over evil, light versus darkness, knowledge versus ignorance, and peace versus destruction. What I am going to show you is a scene of women circling a central figure that in a way depicts very nicely the Garbhis with the pir at the center. And the Garbhis are not only danced during the ritual ceremonies of Navratri, but they are also danced during other celebrations. So in this case, we've got a Garba in Gujarat, and I'm going to show you a clip from what was a movie, but it nicely represents the dancing.
मंजरी आले प्रसाद आज तिसरा महिनो सुरू करू ए आई बा हाल जाओ काले बेगा थाई पाड़ी भरवा करवा करवा जीना हाथ मारा मीठे मारा मन नी घुघरिया जीना ढोल की झपकी मारा पगली बिजलिया जीना हाथ मारा मीठे मारा मन नी घुघरिया जीना ढोल की झपकी मारा पगली बिजलिया हीरो आव्यो रे असवार हीरो आव्यो रे असवार हमारी डबरी नी धूल.
Now, the cover of my book paints the scene described by a narrator. It was this cover, this painting was rendered by the famous Ismaili artist and painter Tazim Jafar. The basic structure of the Garbis is a description of the setting of the festival, primarily dancing and theater, interspersed with long sections of instructions and teachings. The pir arrives in a town called Analwad, where he sees the villagers celebrating Navratri devoted to the goddess Durga. And the scene is one of festivity, revelry, and celebration. And here it is worth reading the Ginaan for you. So he says, O Munivar, know that Shams is the primordial guru. Indeed, he has roamed through many an age. One day he went to a village called Analvad, where countless numbers of Hindus lived. The village was full of shrines and temples dedicated to their goddess Mata Bhavani. It was Navratri and everyone was dancing the Garbhi. To such a place, Guru Shams came. It was the first night of the month Asasiddha. Everyone had come together to dance the first Garbhi. 36 Pandits were telling tales of lore, Katha, with 500 actors enacting them as drama. The Guru went and stood beside them. He listened to the entire recital of the Hindus. They danced fervently and sang with intensity. They dearly worshipped their stone idols. All this aroused anger in Pir Shams. He went and joined the dancers in their dance. Then the Guru began to sing his songs of wisdom, Ginans. The ignorant Hindus were startled and listened to them. So the Pir, who repeatedly refers himself to as Guru, is astonished and angered by this spectacle of 500 villagers dancing and 36 Pandits chanting the Vedas, worshipping the idol of Durga. And he proceeds to the center of the dancers with a dolak and starts to sing Garbhis. Now, this is an important point. The form of his preaching is not foreign. He does not give a sermon in an unfamiliar language or disrupt the celebration in an imposing manner. He looks like a local fakir or mendicant and simply starts to sing the Garbhis in an attractive manner and gains the attention of the listeners who keep dancing. Sometimes there is an impression that because the Garbhis and other Ginans are full of references to local rituals and myths that are loosely defined as Hindu, that they are therefore un-Islamic. This is a mistake made by scholars influenced by Orientalists who presented Islam as an Arabic religion. That is, true Muslims are those whose writings are either in Arabic or Persian. And this is a falsehood. Within a century of the Prophet's mission, the message of Islam had reached China, and it was shaped by the context around. The point being that the kernel of these traditions, including the Ginans, was an Islamic message. And I have tried to illustrate this in the Garbhis, how existing elements in the Hindu or Indic celebration are skillfully transformed into another framework, Satpanth, at the heart of which is the Imam. Here I have tried to illustrate this in a diagram. At the left is the scene the Pir encounters, and at the right, what he manages to do through his Garbis. I will return to this sketch later, but notice how the Hindu scripture Veda Puran is replaced or displaced by the Quran. So let us read some Garbis to see the elements that get transformed, how the Pir shifts their perspective so that at the end, all the dancers break their sacred threads, stop their worship or puja, and the ruler of the town himself is also convinced and prostrates himself before the Guru. This is the second Garbhi, which is one of the favorite ones sung by modern day Ismailis. I will play a verse sung by a young boy so you get an idea of the rhythm and melody. So let us read the Garbhi together. The highlighted words indicate those central elements that come into play that are reshaped or given new meaning, as well as how the Pir's teaching is represented through the local religious dialect. The very first point, which is at the heart of Garbhis, is that follow the Satguru who possesses divine light, Nur, and you will attain bliss or happiness. Notice that the word Nur is used. In later Garbhis, he identifies this Satguru as the Imam Ali. The centrality of the Imam is the kernel of Shia and Ismaili teachings. He then goes on to name the path he is preaching, which is Satpanth, the true path. He also introduces a practice that is fundamental to Satpanth, which is giving the son or tithe. We find in Pir Shams not only teachings about Satpanth, but an emerging framework of ritual practices, including drinking holy water in the Gatpat ceremony. Also notice in this Ginaan that Pir Shams is repeatedly referenced as the Guru, and an analogy between these two figures is developed. Now let's continue with the next Garbhi. He refers to Kali Yuga, the fourth or last age, which is one of darkness, falsehood, and ignorance, and says that countless people were saved by the Satgur, including the king Harishchandra. This theme of the Satgur as savior is reminiscent of the idea of Al-Qaim, who will emerge to establish justice on earth and vanquish the evildoers. Notice the words Vishwas, Amruta, Sati, Munivar are all recognizable by his audience. These words are intermixed with Iman, Murid, and Nur in other Ginans. Another Garbhi offers the culmination of the teachings of Satpanth. The Pir refers to his Garbhis as Ginans, alerting his listeners to this form of his songs, and introduces Naklank, which is a reference to the 10th avatar. Here we have the heart of Satpanth. The last prophet was Muhammad, and Ali has divine light. And the practice of serving them and giving the sond, that is, the dancing and revelry, is supplanted by another act of worship or submission. This Garbhi I have included because it is frequently recited. And here is in Ismaili, in the Jamaat Khana. And here is a rendition accompanied with instruments, which is of course not the actual case of performance in Jamaat Khana. Well, the technology doesn't want to work. Now, notice in this Garbhi that it is through the Vedas that the Pir explains the path of Satpanth. So he retains the Vedas, he doesn't discredit them or reject them, but actually uses them as an avenue to point to Satpanth. And here too, you have a reference to the holy water or paval, which is the ceremony of Gatpat. This Garbhi shows that the Pir was successful in convincing the villagers to embrace Satpanth and give up their worship of the goddess Durga. It goes a step further and shows that they throw away their sacred threads and garbhas or pots. The villagers include the ruler who fixed their minds on Satpanth and abandoned their puja or worship and delighted in the panth marga of religion. They broke their holy threads, and in their hearts the light or nur began to shine. Here once again you have a number of themes that get repeated in the Garbhi. Finally, the last Garbhi, which is another favorite recited in Jamaat Khana. And I will just play a short part of it.
Evi Garbhi sampurna sare, Guru Shams bolya vichar. Evi Garbhi sampurna sare, Guru Shams bolya vichar. Je koi sambhad se ek hi mana, tena sahasra gana puna. Je koi sambhad se ek hi mana, tena sahasra gana तो पामर से पहले पार जे कोई गाए थे नार ने नार ते तो पामर से पहले पार जे कोई सतपंथ की गर्भी गाए तेना प्राचत सर्वे जाए जे कोई सतपंथ की गर्भी गाए तेना प्राचत सर्वे जाए तेरी गर्भी संपूर्ण सार गुर शमश बोल्या विचार.
Now, this last Garbhi is just a beautiful synopsis of the major teachings in the Garbhis. And we see here the importance of listening to the Garbhis, listening to the Ginans, and singing them. And here too, we see the identification of the path that the Pir is teaching as Satpanth, and the attraction of the path leading to heaven or Vaikuntha. It is interesting that the word Vaikuntha is used as salvation. Singing Garbhis and practicing religion or dharma, again here, the word deen is not used. It is used in other Ginans, but here we find the term dharma and vishwas and das, and immortality, which is the word that is used is amar. So what we find here in this final Garbhi is the emphasis is that the villagers would be very familiar with such concepts as attaining heaven or salvation and the vocabulary, which is in Gujarati. The inner meaning of these references is of course attaining salvation through the Satgur or first Imam Ali, who is also mentioned in this Garbhi. Notice the little detail that instructs the villagers to recite the Garbhis on Fridays. So we come back to that diagram that represents the transformation that I'm trying to illustrate that takes place in the Garbhis. You will see more clearly now how Pir Shams accomplishes a remarkable shift away from the celebration of Navratri and the worship of Durga to the faith or Vishwas in the Satgur, identified as Ali. And a new set of practices like the Sond, drinking holy water, and singing the Garbhis and Ginans. He does not refrain from being critical of the practices he observes, but uses logic like the idols are but stone, and then offers the promise of salvation through Ali and the Vedas, that is the Quran, identified partly as the Quran. So as I said at the beginning of the lecture, the Ginaan are indeed a wonderful tradition in the history of Ismailism. The Pir's accomplishments are remembered through them, and central tenets of the faith are conveyed and retained, although in a new language, with rich symbols and references to the existing religious ideas and cultures that existed where the Pirs preached. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, and I would like to welcome Hussein Jasani, who is going to assist me, or rather join me in responding some of your questions. Hussein is very deeply familiar with the Ginans and with the literature that is part of the context, the cultural context in which the Pirs found themselves.
Thank you, Professor Qasim, for such a wonderfully insightful and enlightening presentation. It was very interesting to hear about your own personal interest in Ginans, which stemmed from your father. You also sketched a brief history of Ismailism and how Pirs were sent to the subcontinent, and the way they learned local languages, primarily of Gujarat and Sindh. And you also talk about the performative nature of Ginans. Also importantly, you mentioned the method of approach of the Dawah, which was to convince people through logic that would appeal to them. The imagery of the diagram which you showed, through which you depict how peers shift their perspectives, people's perspectives, and how their thinkings are reshaped, is fascinating. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Welcome, Hussein. We shall now begin our Q&A session, as Professor Qasim mentioned, and we'll have a panel of two, Hussein as well as Rai Hussein Jasani. I've already introduced you before. May I request people to give your questions or write your questions down in the chat box to the host, in which there's written host. So please write the questions there. All right, so let me start just by the first question itself. I do have a couple of questions already. Let me begin by asking. So one of the first questions is, Ivanov in his Collectinia has cast serious doubts on Pir Shams being the composer of Garbhis. He states that these are of much modern period and may be authorship of many people. What is your opinion on this aspect? And I will ask a second question, which is related. Ivanov also casts doubts on the miracles of Pir Shams. He states that these are not truly associated to the actual historical Pir Shams, but rather from an Indo-Muslim folklore. What is your opinion on this as well?
So I tried to address this when I talked about the distinction between communal memory and history, at least what we think about traditionally as history, you know, because history itself is multifaceted. It depends on what your source material is before we can make any determination of actual events and historical figures. So the question of miracles is an interesting question, and I tried to address that in my presentation, which is that if we try to look at this more symbolically, what is clearly captured is the personality, the powerful personality of Pir Shams. The question of whether miracles happen or not is something that is raised in all religious traditions. You know, did Moses really part the sea? And, you know, there are so many miracles about Jesus. So the issue of miracles, we need to sort of contextualize in the framework of faith, and how a faith community actually is shaped by sort of the emotions of a community are shaped by these miraculous stories. They're inspired by them, and these figures are held to be central in their communal memory. So that's how I would respond to that question. I mean, there are many parts of the question. You know, Ivanov was one of the most important scholars of early scholars of Ismailism. And he has his own points of view, and he discredited the miracles, but he may not have been able to see the significance of the miracles from the point of view of the community and its own imagined sense of their past. The only other point that I would add there also is in terms of the history of the Garbhis, you know, whether they are more modern in formulation. I said that the tradition was an oral tradition, and it was only, you know, put into writing or manuscripts, you know, in the time of Pir Sadruddin. Even those manuscripts and the script itself, there's a lot of variation and so forth. The issue can be raised that, you know, how did the Ginans evolve in terms of authorship and in terms of changes of vocabulary and so forth. Hussein, you must have something to add.
Qasim, it was a pleasure listening to you. I must kind of acknowledge my compliment to Meera's eloquent way of expressing her kind of appreciation for your talk. The question is very interesting, and I'm happy that we are remembering Ivanov through this question. Small kind of update for the audience, those who are interested. There is going to be an Ivanov exhibition. I think the launch is within a week or 10 days in London at the Aga Khan Center. So very important figure, obviously. What we need to understand is, what is being discussed here. First of all, we need to acknowledge that we are talking about oral tradition that was not committed to paper, at least not extensively committed to paper for a real long time. So the tradition remained oral for a long time, and oral traditions tend to pick up the color of the context in which they are used. So a word is pronounced in a particular manner in Sindhi, but when it travels to Gujarat, the pronunciation would shift. And if somebody applies linguistic analysis tool, you're picking up the language and saying like, this word was introduced in the 18th century. And because that word exists in a Ginaan, the Ginaan must have been written in the 18th century. That approach itself requires little kind of digging little deeper. So it's much complex matter that we're discussing here. The other thing is, when you analyze Ginaans, they talk about the whole process. So what do we believe? Do we believe that Pir sat and wrote the Ginaans in the local language? Ginaans talk about, Vimras Vani Gur Aap Bolya. Like, look at that Ginaan. Vimras Vani Gur Ape Bolya. So yes, Gur is speaking, the Pir is speaking, but through the language of the Chela or the disciple. And if that was the process of Ginaan composition and transmission, then yes, it's possible that Ivano came across some words and phrases that didn't belong to the time period or the context. And as an academic scholar, he did question the kind of timing of the Ginaan. On the other hand, are these new symbols, new way of talking? No, if you look at the context and cultural context, these stories go back to thousands of years, right? And some of the vocabulary that we see in the Ginaan existed before Pirs arrived. So it's very difficult to date Ginaans. Certainly manuscripts don't help us, because the earliest that I have seen is from 1736. I understand that there are some that have been identified, and inshallah, very soon the IIS is going to publish the Khojki catalog of the Khojki manuscripts, and we'll come across some manuscripts from the 17th century, hopefully, inshallah. A scholar Mumtaz Sadiq Ali talks about earlier manuscripts as well, but many of us scholars of the Ginanic studies have not actually dealt with any of these 14th, 15th century manuscripts. So yeah, I mean, some of that didn't survive, but reappropriated. Maybe the vocabulary changed slightly because it traveled through the oral means rather than the written means, and oral traditions tend to evolve. So those are the things that one needs to keep in mind while dealing with this question. So interesting question, but well responded by Professor Kassam. So I don't need to add further. I just wanted to add a few additional details to that. In terms of miracle, all needs to understand that believers tend to speak about the masters as if so if I have a belief that master cure, or my guru, or my spiritual leader, or my imam can do something, when I speak to my children, I would speak as if he has already done it. Because in my mind, the certainty is to the extent where what can happen becomes, gets expressed in the past tense, as if it has already been done. If you understand this process, of the usage of language, a lot of these things, when we say that peers have done this and all that, we have no doubt that peers could do that. If my imam could do this, then I would speak as if he has already done it. And that's the language, that's the beauty of the language of religion and the religious discourse. And that's what we need to understand. When we start going and applying scientific tools and look at these things, that itself is, we have the disciplines, various disciplines, and they need to be, mathematical principles can't be just picked up and applied to some other field. Physics, cannot be used for biology. And of course, there would be some overlap, but that each discipline has its own tools and ways of doing things. And I would suggest that miracles themselves need to be looked at from the religious literature perspective, religious studies perspective. So yeah, those are the things that I wanted to add.
Thank you, Sen. I have another question. Why, apart from Pir Shams, none of the other Pirs or Sayyids composed Ginans in the Garbhi genre or style?
You'll have to ask the peers that. Yeah, that's the only response I can give. You will have to ask the peers that question, because the peers are the ones that have composed these Ginans, and in the case of Pir Shams, the Garbhis. It could have to do with the specific context in which the Pir found himself, where Navratri was in fact celebrated. But as the point was made earlier, it's the historical context as well that one must keep in mind and think about, the transmission of these Garbis or even Ginans, how they get reshaped by the cultural context in which they are recited. If it is an oral tradition, it is attuned to that local context. But that is why I said in my presentation that we don't know exactly if these events happened in the way in which they're described. But there is something to be said about the fact that there is probably a kernel of truth in that the Pir did communicate with those whom he found themselves with or amongst, and he communicated with them in such a way that was in their worldview. He introduces another worldview very deftly, but he still speaks in a language that they can understand. This whole subject of Quran aligned with the Vedas and the Puranas or Kathas. That's very interesting, how he goes from the Vedas into the Quran, how he goes from guru to Pir, because he calls himself Guru all the time in the Garbhis. That alignment of the concept of Guru with the Pir, which is a teacher, a mentor, someone who is believed to have spiritual powers. So these are the things that I think are really important when we look at the Garbhis, because remember, we are looking at the Garbhis from our time, from our perspective, with our store of knowledge, with our exposure to different disciplines. And so the larger question is, what kind of meaning can we draw from these hymns? And I would say that if we concentrate on the heart of the Garbhis and what transformation they brought about, this gives you a sense of the significance of the role that the priests have played in South Asia. Now remember that in early this century, it is the South Asian Ismaili community that was the largest Ismaili community. And there are many reasons for that. One of the reasons that you have a smaller communities that developed in other areas is because of persecution. They had to be very, very much in taqiyya. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this is a significant tradition, existing for 8 centuries at least, and sustaining itself over that period, shaping the identity of South Asian Ismailis, creating, in a sense, a faith, a path, but without sacrificing the central tenets of Shiism, in particular Ismailism, the centrality of the Imam, and in this case, identified with Ali. And there are many Ginans where the Imams that were contemporary to the period of the Pirs is mentioned. So actually in the Garbhis, we have got a reference to 2 Imams that are later than the period of Pir Shams, so I can see why Ivana was saying, well, these are not as early as we think they are. But as they are recited, the Imam present at that time's name was probably inserted into the Garbhi. So those are interesting questions, but I go back to my central point, which is that there is a kernel of truth in the sense of the identification of the South Asian Ismailis with, or South Asian Satpanth Ismailis, with the, larger Shia Ismaili tradition and the core concepts. We need to keep this in mind. And I am responding to the unfortunate tendency sometimes of referring to the Ginans as Hindu literature. And that is, I think, a big mistake, and it fails to appreciate what an extraordinary tradition is. It is, and what an extraordinary accomplishment the peers made in that context. It was, you have, that you don't have that many peers if you think about it over 8 centuries. And so this contribution is vast and extraordinary in establishing a religious tradition that has its own rituals, structure, and manifestation, and continued links with the imams. Let's remember that. Those links were never ruptured, and that's really critical. So that would be my response to the question. It's a bit long-winded, but...
Thank you, Professor Kassam. I have very many questions, so I'll better get on to with it.
But Meera, before you get in, we still sing happy birthday after so many years. Why reinvent if something is working? If you had the Garbhis, maybe there was never a need was not felt to reinvent the Garbhis. So I think, because these are beautiful Garbhis, and you played, Professor Kassam, some of them. It was an amazing experience. But go ahead. Sorry, Meera, I interrupted.
No problem. Another question is, would it be possible, somebody's asked, would it be possible to know the source of the diagram that depicts the shift to Satpanth?
I'm the one that is the source of the diagram.
So basically, probably it's the person is meaning to ask, I suppose, I may be wrong, how did you think that the shift is from this to this, I suppose. But I suppose you explained that.
From the Garbhis. This is a diagram that evolved from my understanding of what shifts are occurring in the Garbhis, and using, the terminology and seeing how the peer basically transforms the meaning of various terms and points in another direction. So whatever this diagram, this is not something that I have taken from another source, but it is really, it emerges. It's what I understood is emerging from the Garbhis themselves.
You've made an imagery out of your understanding of what the Garbhis talk about.
Exactly.
I have another question. Thank you, Professor Kassam. I have another question. Somebody has written about, to explain in short about the 10th incarnation of Maula Ali and its concept related to conversion.
The 10th incarnation of Maulana Ali. I think what it referenced is the 10th incarnation of Vishnu, and the identification of that incarnation as Hazrat Ali. I think that's what's being asked. And so one of the words that appears in the Garbhis is Naklank. And Naklank is, another way of describing Naklank is Kalki, the Kalki avatar, that is the 10th avatar. And so this is the avatar that the Vaishnavites consider to be the avatar that will appear, the final avatar that will bring justice on earth, that will destroy evil, and the world will be restored to truth. So this idea is taken, and Hazrat Ali is pointed to, or the Satgur, who is Hazrat Ali, is pointed to as the avatar that has arrived, that is already, and the word avatariya is very often used in the Ginans, that this figure that they are looking towards, that will appear, has already appeared, already exists in the figure of the Satgur or Imam.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kassam. There's another question. It's about the historicity of Ginans and Garbhis. So the question is, if Pir Shams lived in Multan, then why is he not writing in Saraiki or Punjabi? For instance, Ali Asani, in the case of Bhuj Niranjan, he has questioned whether or not it was truly written by Pir Shams.
So I'll respond to that briefly, and then I'll turn it to Hussein. The question of authenticity is very, very problematic. And I've said a couple of times, and Hussein has iterated this. This was an oral tradition. It's a tradition that got transmitted in various regions, and it may have reshaped itself as it was transmitted through these different regions. Now, the question that's asked is, why didn't Pir Shams write in Saraiki? Or, why aren't there Ginans that are in languages that are more familiar to the area of Multan and so forth. Now, there are Ginans that Pir Shams has composed that are in a dialect that draws vocabulary from the area of Sindh, and northern Sindh. So it's not entirely the case that there isn't material, that's composed by Pir Shams in those languages. But this question is very similar to the question, first of all, can the Pir have written the Garbhis, because they appear to be more associated with modern or pre-modern Gujarat, rather than the northern area of Sindh. And the reason why the question of authenticity bothers me is that it makes suspicious the origin of the Ginans. And I think one of the things that I'm fairly confident about is that the Ginan tradition was evolved, created by the Pirs. It is a distinct tradition. It might have drawn from influences in the context, definitely, but that does not mean that it is inauthentic. Hussein, let me have you respond to this, because I can see you.
No, I think you answered it well. I mean, there are three words that one needs to keep in mind, and one is authenticity, that the question included, then the authorship, and the third is authority. And sometimes, I use this example, like when Imam gives us something saying, Maulana Rumi said this, or Prophet Muhammad said this, the authority of the Imam makes it authentic. We don't go looking for that text we don't go searching archives to look for that text, because the authority that is giving you that text is more important than the author of the text. And we need to understand that, in the case of Ginans, I mean, Pirs may have picked up text which was kind of maybe culturally common amongst the people there, and may have reused it or reappropriated it. So this idea of Naklang that you spoke about, this whole, cosmology that, we talk about the Indian Satyug, Dwapar, Treta, and Kali Yuga, the four yugas, and each yuga having its own master, and there are 10 incarnations, and then Kalki, or the Naklang or Nishkalank being, the one that would come in the Kali Yuga and would kind of ensure that there is restoration of justice. That whole idea is culturally rooted, that was reappropriated, in our context. And similarly, I think, what matters to us, and this again, I'm borrowing this from Ali Asani's work. When he talks about Bhuj Niranjan, he clarifies this, that what matters, authority or authorship. And for Ismailis, authority does matter, and I think that's the important point, and I think Professor Kassam has already highlighted that beautifully. So I don't need to add any further to that.
Thanks to you both. Another question: can you speak at all to Shamsis, a Gupti community that is said to have been converted by Pir Shams? Do they hold on to more Punjabi Ginans? What about Shams Rishi, Samas Rishi, that converted Nizarpanthis in Rajasthan, and Agam Vani tradition that Dominic Silla Khan wrote about, sorry.
So I'm going to turn this over to Hussein because he's more familiar with these groups.
Okay, so, when we talk about these groups, of course, Shamshi is from, the Sindh region. We still have Ismailis who are Shamshi Ismailis. And the name Shams and Shams Rashid that was mentioned in the context of Rajasthan tradition, and Dominic Sheila Khan's very famous work, Crossing the Threshold, and Ramdev Pir, one on Ramdev Pir, both talk about these traditions. Now, what we need to, I've not fully understood the question, where the question is coming from. So yes, we have Shamshi Ismailis, like we have many Ismailis. We have, Punjabi Ismailis, we have Shamshi Ismailis, we have amongst Khoja Ismailis, we have various groups, but we also have Moman Ismailis, who have again two groups, Moman Kathiawadis, but we also have Sitpuri Moman. Then we also have Gupti Ismailis, and Gupti Ismailis are also not limited to only Shamshi Ismailis or Punjabi Ismailis or Bhavnagaris, or we do have Guptis in Khambat, we have Guptis in Mumbai. We have had Gupti groups. Basically, Gupti literally means those who kept their identity. I think the word takiya was used quite a few times by Professor Kassam, and that idea of hiding your identity for the survival, for the sake of survival, is very common, and Guptis were guided. In fact, as late as Imam Sulaiman Shah's time, they were guided by the Imam of the time on how to disclose their identities or what route to take to become an Ismaili. So it was quite a detailed procedure that Maulana Sultan Muhammad Shah had prescribed to the groups. Sometimes, finding the historic figure of, a particular peer is difficult because the same individual gets referred to in many different ways, but also the same individual also, it becomes an archetypical kind of image that you have of a guru, and the same name is being used by multiple individuals, because they are sourcing their authority from that figure. So that's another phenomenon that we need to understand. So many of the chelas would not attribute. The classic example that I can think of is Maulana Rumi writing poetry and calling it Kitab Shams Tabriz. So it's Kitab Shams Tabriz is written by Maulana Rumi, but he's attributing that all knowledge that he has is sourced from his guru or his master, and thus he doesn't want to attribute to himself. So it becomes Kitab Shams Tabriz, and that process was not very uncommon. In fact, that's seen even today. Many people attribute the works. So Linda Hayes has done a wonderful work on Kabir, and she talks about Kabir gets reinvented in every phase, every period. Things get attributed to Kabir that Kabir never spoke about. And then Bollywood has gotten onto the bandwagon, Kaheta Kabir, Suno Bhai Sadhu, and then add anything that goes after it, and it's attributed to Kabir. Not necessarily Kabir said that. So this process is sometimes done out of veneration, respect, commitment, and sometimes to seek that authority of that figure and achieve things in the name of that person, because I'm not important. Lot of times you hear Maula karata hai, Maula karave che, Jevi Maulani marzi. Not necessarily, Maula kind of called me to say this, but we believe that we are nothing. In the larger scheme of things, only the guru matters, and thus a lot of these things are attributed to Pir Shams. And in various parts of Gujarat, Kutch, he was larger than life figure that survived for many centuries, and today we are talking about him. And he's an understudied figure, by the way. I think Professor Qasim remains to be the only scholar who has extensively worked on his literature. That 106 Ginans that we see in her work. I don't think anybody has managed to surpass that.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer, Hussain. Professor Qasim, there's another question for you. Are you able to comment on the ragas Pir Shams selected when he used to sing Garbis?
Before you get into it, I can't answer that question. I'm not trained in music, but I can disclose. I don't know whether, Meera, you use that statement. Professor Kassam has been the student of Dr. Prabha.
I did
I
mention.
had the pleasure of, being in their company once in Mumbai. And I think, Dr. Kassam, this is your domain. Yeah, go ahead, please, ragas.
Well, thank you. It has sometimes been said that it's the ragas that are identified with the Ginans are sometimes identified with the classical ragas. Now, what I would like to draw your attention to is the word rag means melody as well. Injo rag kuroi, or so we say, what's the tune of that Ginan? Now that's very different from what we talk about classical rags. So if you refer to Malkauns, or Jogia or Yaman, these are all Ginans that, these are all ragas that are of a particular scale. The notes are set and you don't deviate from that scale. So you do all your improvisation in that scale. Now, another word that I've just brought up is improvisation. Raga music is improvisation. We don't have improvisation in the Ginans. We have a fixed tune. And usually all the verses of the Ginans are in that tune. And there is a good functional reason for that. It's that you can recite, you can remember the Ginans when the tune is consistent from verse to verse. It also helps with the rhyming and rhythm of the poetry itself. So I think the first point that I would make is I don't exactly know whether the ragas of the Ginans can be identified with the classical music ragas, even though that has been suggested. And it has also been suggested, therefore, that, there are particular rasas that a rag will evoke karuna, rasa, which is sadness or whatever. And with my experience in Indian classical music, I can say that Yaman can be sung in many rasas. It's not necessarily the case that even this particular rag cannot have a happy, expression or something that is sad and soulful and things like that. We can say that a particular tune is very soulful or it's very peaceful. We can generally say that the tunes or melodies of the Ginans are sober, with the exception of the Garbis, where you really do have this beat and this upbeat sense to them, but they are associated with the dance, But there are some Ginans that you might find an emphasis on rhythm, and rhythm gives that kind of, I would say, the mood. When there is a strong rhythm, that affects the mood of a Ginan. But the Ginans are otherwise very slowly and carefully recited. There's a respectful ethos to them. They don't even sound too much like bhajans. They have been compared to bhajans, but bhajans also have a lot of emphasis on the tunes. You'll notice that with the Ginans, the emphasis is on the words. It's on the poetry. And the rag is to assist the poetry. It's not to take away the poetry. Of course, the rag is, when it's beautiful, it increases your focus and your attention to the Ginan. So that's very important. The actual recitation of the Ginan, beautiful voice and nicely, done with pronunciation that's precise. Those are important things. But my sense, I would submit that when we talk about ragas in terms of, or rag, in terms of the Ginans, we should see this more as melody, a fixed melody that is associated with the Ginan. Now, I don't know whether Pir Shams invented the melodies of the Garbhis. And I go back to that same question, which is one of, okay, so when we talk about transmission, what happens in the context of transmission? I'm pretty certain that there are periods when the transmission is relatively consistent. I recall, especially with oral traditions, I recall when I was growing up and going to night school, that we would have Ginan classes and we would have to memorize the whole Ginan. These days, we only recite 3 or 4 verses of a Ginan. There was a point in time when you had to, recite 18 verses, if that's how many verses there were in the Ginan. And the teacher would be very, very particular about the pronunciation and the tune. So this was an oral form of teaching. We didn't have a book in front of us. He would write the Ginan on the blackboard and we would have to memorize it. And that was it. That was the exposure that we had to it. So we really needed to recognize it and remember it. And so my sense is that the tunes may be more consistent in their transmission. You heard the Ginans that were recited with music. Notice that they were not changed. The tune of the Ginan was not changed. And that's really important, that you're getting instrumental accompaniment with Ginans, but still there is an effort to keep the Ginan tune consistent. But I still cannot answer the question. Did Pir Shams actually compose the Ginans the Garbhis that we have in the form that we have today in those melodies? I can't say that because I don't know how I would ascertain that. You've got to have sources, that allow you to say, okay, so you can see that this rag is consistently mentioned in these manuscripts, and so on and so forth. So that would be my response to that question.
Meera,
thank you, Professor Kassam.
There are some very interesting comments made in the chat box by some of my gurus, Professor Amy Kathleen Jerajboy. Professor Kassam, you would be happy to know that Amy is on the call as well, and she has provided some details. And we have Pali Keshwani, again, my guru. And while we are talking about melody and tunes and rag and classical rags, I want to remind the audience that ASG had organized a talk by, and Meera was coordinating that, of Dr. Karim Gilani, who has done some amazing work on the Ginans. And currently we are working on a project of publishing musicology of Ginan, the work that was done by Dr. Ali Dina. And inshallah, once that comes out, he makes some because he was a trained musician, he understood music, he spoke to quite a few stars on both sides of the border, India and Pakistan. And those works will shed more light. But there's some interesting comments in the chat box about Ivano relying on the secondhand because he didn't understand the language. He relied on his friends, Khoja friends in Mumbai for the information. Khalil has mentioned Patra, not only avatar, but in between stages called Patra. So there's some interesting data there. Please, audience, we don't have time to go through all the kind of comments, but they're very useful comments by quite a few of them. So please go to the chat box. Thanks, Meera.
Thanks, Susan. There are some wonderful comments, but in the interest of time, I'm not saying that because this is not the time. There is another question, one of the last questions, which is just coming in. Did Pir Shams ever mention reciting Quran Waqt Ni Dua in his attributed works? Is it true that he compiled a Punjabi dua prior to the Asal dua?
I honestly do not know. Hussein, do you have any clue as to whether Pir Shams had anything to do with the dua? So, I thought it was, my sense was that it was connected with Pir Sadruddin, if that,
Yeah. Generally, the names that we hear is Pir Sadruddin and sometimes Pir Dadu. But we've never heard of dua being associated with Pir Shams. But, the various times and, praying at a particular time, those kind of content, there are Ginans which talk about the timing of prayer or what is the best time to meditate and, dhyan and that kind of stuff. So timings are mentioned, but I don't think the word dua appears, and certainly not 3 times. And even in the sources that I have studied, as Professor Kassam has highlighted, most sources take it back to Pir Sadruddin's time. There is Imam Sulaiman Shah's Farman, which says that Tame Pir Sadruddin niya peli dua padho cho. So, I mean, we Shias, believe that once the Imam says, then you don't require an evidence for something like that. And yeah, so generally it's Pir Sadruddin, who was a later Pir than Pir Shams. Pir Shams is seen to be an earlier, Pir than Pir Sadruddin.
Thank you, Sen. One last question, which I generally ask all the scholars, who come on Ginan Insights, is what are the research topics you would suggest or recommend to a new researcher? Because Ginans is such a vast corpus. I mean, there's so much to do. What is it you, as a Ginan scholar, would suggest or recommend in terms of research topics?
Well, I guess because of my own interest in music, I think I'm very happy with Karim Gilani's, research on that aspect of the Ginans. And I think a lot can be done there. The other thing is looking at those manuscripts and dealing with Khochki, the script itself and the variants of the script. Professor Asani has done some remarkable work with that. Zawahir Muar before him worked very much on the Khochki script and the manuscripts. I'm very glad to hear that the manuscripts are being cataloged, but someone needs to actually look at the manuscripts and try to see if there is a sort of a transmission that goes from manuscript to manuscript, or they're just basically, you can't actually see the line of transmission, or that one manuscript was copied from another manuscript. The other one is philology, the words of the Ginans, because as Hussein mentioned, the same word would be used differently maybe in another region. And there are many words that might not be Gujarati and might not be Sindhi or Saraiki, and you kind of have to figure it out, what changes must have gone through, that particular word might have gone through, what it might actually mean. So there's philological work to be done as well. And then, the thematics, the content of the Ginans, the themes in the Ginans, and that is very vast. You can take the theme of love, Abateri Muhammad Alagi, Mere Sahib, that's only one Ginan that I'm bringing up. But you can look at a vast number of themes that are in the Ginans. Those who really are interested in historicity can pursue that, but because it's an oral tradition, I think those questions would be more challenging. They're possible. And I tried to reconstruct Pir Shams, it was still very hard. It's possible, but it's a worthy venture if one wants to take it on. So there's a tremendous amount of work that one can do on the Ginans, and not enough work has been, I can say definitively, not enough work has been done on the Ginans. And one more thing, contextualizing the Ginans within the larger South Asian literature, seeing resonances and distinctions, because I think this is a distinct tradition. It's a unique tradition, but still it has to be viewed in the context of other traditions that are side by side it, and look at, whether it might have been some of these compositions were inspired by those, what relationships in terms of communities might be, might alert us, the Ginans might alert us to. There might be connections, between communities. So these are some of the things that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the comments, and Khalil Andani has written something interesting. This big comments, but wonderful, that the wonderful comments, and I think it's to everybody, so everybody can actually read it. Thank you, Khalil Andani, for that. And there's a lot more comments. Wonderful. What more can I say? It's been a fantastic session. So I think that brings us to the end of the Q&A. And may I request everybody to please write your feedbacks by clicking on the feedback form in the chat box. You can also sign up for our FB page. You will receive past recordings of our webinars, as well as notifications of future events. Thank you.
Thank you to both Meera, the Association of Ginan Studies, And I would also like to thank Hussein for joining us in this conversation. It's been wonderful to have you along.
No, in fact, I was requesting a minute from Meera because I wanted to thank you. Thanks, Professor Kassam, for inviting me. That's your humility. I don't think you need anybody to support you. You are my guru, so I must acknowledge that. And the second thing is, yes, I mean, a lot needs to be done. The catalog of Khochki manuscripts should be out. Dr. Wafi Momin is working on it, and last I spoke to him, he's expecting it to be out sometime early 2022. So we'll have a lot more information about how the Khochki manuscripts kind of, evolve over a time period. But we do see Rag being mentioned in some of the manuscripts. So if we want to take it back, Rag discussion, we can take it back to that period when the Rag gets mentioned for the first time.
Yes.
We also had Lalji Devraj publishing something called Rag Mara, which actually gave the detail on the tunes and melodies of various ragas. And of course, there is this whole idea of Jodila, where a Ginaan is kind of very popular and another Ginaan needs to be sung, and somebody would say this Ginaan is the Jodila of the other Ginaan, which simply means that you can sing this Ginaan in the same tune as the other Ginaan. So that there is a lot kind of that can be discussed on Rag, but most important thing, this is a field which has not been fully explored, and it's just emerging now, and we have more and more people, and it's good to see, Meera, that you managed to get over 200 people log in. It's good to see that so many of them are interested in this field.
Thanks to
Thank
Professor
you.
Kassam's.
Thank you, ASG. Thank you, Professor Kassam, and thanks, Meera.
You're welcome.
So thank you all. As we come to the end of this webinar session, I would like to say a very big thank you to Professor Kassam for sharing your wonderful work with us on Pir Shams's Ginans and Garbhis. We're all enriched by your knowledge and your translations, which you have shared with us, and your time. A special thank you to Rai Hussain Jasani for being part of the Q&A session. Finally, many thanks to all of you, the audience who have joined us from across the world. Thank you for spending part of your Sunday with us. And please be on a lookout for our future ASG programs on Facebook, and also our webinar recording on the ASG YouTube channel, as well as our upcoming ASG website. That's it from me. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Malali Madad.